So thank you all for staying for this panel. This is a centrally important topic in this important region. And we have a lot to say about it in the next 45 minutes. Before I try and frame those discussions, let me introduce you to these panelists. First, on my immediate left on screen, Nazir Razak was most known for taking over CIMB, a small bank in Malaysia, and turning it into a regional powerhouse. It's now the 5th largest universal bank in the region and the largest investment bank. Since then, he left to form Ikhlas Capital, a major investor in the region. And relevant for our discussions is now also the chair of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. And he, in fact, going straight back to KAL after this session because the ASEAN Summit is next week. Second is, well, I'm going to go next to Gita because he will speak second. Gita, you've met several times over the course of this day because he is, of course, the impresario behind this whole event, really made it happen. But two things you haven't really heard very much about is that about a decade ago, he took over as chair of the National Badminton Association of Indonesia and returned them to prominence in the global badminton world. So that's one big thing. And secondly, he now has a podcast, which some of you will have heard, but which has something like 1.5 million subscribers and reaches 105 million people. So quite something, especially for a podcast that's about public policy issues. And then the third panelist is David Cohen, one of our own, professor here. So I have to say there's an annoying fact about David Cohen. Most people would be thrilled to become a professor at Stanford in any discipline. He's a professor in 3 different ones, which drives me crazy. So he's a professor of classics, an expert on Greek history. He's a professor of human rights and international justice, and he's now a professor of socio-environmental systems in the Dorr School. But it's just a reflection of the breadth of his knowledge and insight and the breadth of his work. And over the last 25 years has been very, very active in the ASEAN region, including in particular Indonesia. So you are in good hands to hear about this important topic. Let me say a few things by way of framing, and then I will turn over so that you can hear from the real experts. You'll hear from political leaders across this region, and it's true in other regions as well, but certainly vividly true in this region, of the central importance of food security to their development ambitions. And you hear that from their partners as well. The Asian Development Bank recently announced that they will commit a total of $40 billion in the region over the course of this decade. So this is an issue that has returned to prominence in recent years. 40 years ago, no, almost 60 years ago, Stanford first got involved in Indonesia and supporting work on food security. 1968, Professor Wally Falcon went to Indonesia and over the course of the next 40 years went there 100 times, spending 2 months there every summer, working with the government, the finance ministry, the planning ministry, the logistics ministry, to help them bring green revolution rice into Indonesian agriculture. And over the course of those 40 years, doubling the productivity of rice production in the country, playing a central role, that effort playing a central role in ending or reducing hunger in Indonesia. And you see similar progress in other parts of the region. What we see now is 2 things. One is a recognition that food security is still important. When you have disruptions like a COVID pandemic or a war in Ukraine, you get disruptions that ripple across food systems around the world. And so paying attention to the security of food supply is important. But the second is a recognition that it's one thing to have enough calories, and that's a first requirement, but it's also important to get the nutrients, protein and micronutrients that are essential to healthy development. And as President Yudhoyono mentioned this morning, there are many parts of the region that still have, where 1 in 4 children is stunted, doesn't fully develop physically or intellectually because they don't get the nutrients they need in the first 1,000 days of life. And you see broader nutrient deficiencies across school children, across adults in many parts of the region. So that's a central challenge now as we talk about food security is malnutrition. One particular dimension to this challenge in the region is that production is overwhelmingly in the hands of small farmers and small fishers. More than 90% of the producers are small-scale actors. On average, on the farm side, half a hectare of land, and on the ocean side, very small boats. And supporting small-scale producers, helping them become more productive, is a core challenge and actually quite a difficult one. And finally, of course, the theme of this conference, food systems like energy systems face daunting challenges of sustainability. Right? Whether it's deforestation driven by expansion of palm oil production historically, for example, or it is overfishing or destructive fishing practices, there are many sustainability issues at the core of this sector in ASEAN as in other parts of the world. And finally, those of you who know me will know that we have to talk about blue foods, and it's in fact in the title of this session, I believe. One of the extraordinary opportunities in this region is blue foods, food produced in the water. This is the richest part of the world for marine biodiversity and for fish. It's also a world very rich in freshwater fisheries and aquaculture. And so this is a place where blue foods can play a particular role in meeting the challenges we've just described. As it turns out, blue foods very rich in the micronutrients that are needed for healthy development, and more affordable and accessible than other sources of animal protein. Much more affordable than beef, often more affordable than chicken. And so as we think about how the region meets the challenges of a healthier, more sustainable food system, blue foods emerge as actually a central part of the answer. So those are the kinds of things we're going to get into in the next 45 minutes. Let me turn first to Nazir, who's been at the heart of the system as a banker and leading investor, to talk about how the private sector can play roles here. So Nazir, just to get us started, I mean, as you look at this challenge, which we know is centrally important to governments and to everyone in the region, what roles do you see for private investment and what's needed for private investment to support the changes that need to happen?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having me. Long way to come, but absolutely worthwhile, if not for the weather. I have looked at this food security issue from the front lines, if you like, and clearly, as it's a regional problem, but it has to be dealt with nationally. I'm afraid ASEAN doesn't really have the reach or power to do very much in this space. Malaysia has a huge import bill. I think something like 9% of our total imports are food stuff that we can actually grow, but we don't. And even the most basic like onions, beef, coffee, fruits are imported. So our government says, look, we need to invest in agriculture. We need to reduce this import bill. It is a security issue. So the private sector has been invited to look at this issue, and it's a difficult one. As we look closer, there are a lot of structural issues which you brought up, some of them like the fragmentation of land, unreliable infrastructure, and so on. So private sector in terms of equity capital and also banking funds are quite reluctant players in the agricultural sector. Why? I guess, first of all, the basics is there are better returns elsewhere. Two is I think there's a lot of risk that's very difficult to insure against, including weather, disease, but also price controls that tend to come in many food stuff. And thirdly, I think there's the whole politics of in the agriculture sector. It leads to price controls, but it also limits what one can do in terms of, for instance, consolidating land, introducing agri-tech, and so on. And let me give you an example. A few years ago, I decided that maybe I should go into agriculture. And there was this whole opening up of China as a market for Malaysian durians. We discovered that, basically the stats show that the Chinese couldn't get enough of durians, and 95% of durians consumed in China was from Thailand. And everybody knows that Malaysian durians are the best. Especially even better than Indonesian durians, for sure. just be clear. That's just for the crowd here. And then when I went into it, firstly, there were smallholders, and whatever logic you can communicate to them, they were still controlled by middlemen. And these are deep, long relationships that have been held, very difficult to undo. Two is there were a lot of illegal farmers, and when you irritate illegal farmers, it becomes political. And always remember that the rural voter has maybe 4 or 5 times the number of votes compared to an urban voter. And that's why they're very dangerous. And the politician does not want to disrupt the formula that put him there in the first place. So very difficult to shift them. Banks were very reluctant to take risks in the agriculture sector. And development banks had limited capacity. And then finally, I discovered a lot of execution risks, complexities in production and distribution. So I am an example of someone who tried it, but lost money and now exited the sector. So, and then I think about what needs to be done. Well, I think in agriculture, the state can play a bigger role. And the state has tried. We've had in Malaysia success. We had FELDA, which has been hugely successful resettlement scheme, and where the state comes and plays sort of big brother to teach smallholders how to cultivate small pieces of land. And when it gets uneconomic by generational division, the state comes in and consolidates and manages. And that's been a successful program. But in the mid-2000s, we had what was known as the MAFC, Malaysia Agriculture Food Corporation, where the government came in, invested a lot of money, saying agriculture needs to be revitalized. The government invested in logistics, invested in promoting large-scale farms, and so on and so forth. And I think the government burned something like 99% of the capital it put into the agriculture sector because of the middlemen and the reluctance of smallholders to play. So, I think one needs to nevertheless persevere and look at how governments can come in collaboration with the private sector and do a better job. That's my view. I think one is we need to improve the capacity of government. Within these 4 walls, typically in Malaysia, the Minister of Agriculture is the last traded position amongst political parties. And typically, very rarely is he able to do his job. And it's because he can't do any job, he gets agriculture. And then even within the civil service, the better talents are in finance, economy, etc. So this needs to be addressed. Yeah, I think the only country that's addressed it in the region is probably the Philippines, where the president himself is the Secretary of Agriculture, and I think that's an example. I think we need to look at success stories. One success story is a company called Farm Fresh in Malaysia, where the government and private sector partnered. It was an entrepreneur. Khazanah, the sovereign wealth fund, came in, and it was hugely successful. But when you look at it, it was actually dairy farming. And it was an area which they had very little competition. There was no entrenched interest in it. And they basically imported cows, literally. And they genetically enhanced cows so that they can be productive in the tropics. So that's an example of a success story that we need to study and replicate. And finally, I think there needs to be structuring in how the government comes in, as in what will the government do? What kind of risk can the government insure? What kind of capital the government can put in? And what kind of capital should the private sector put in? So that's my view. I think we can get more private sector capital, but the government must come in and underwrite areas where the private sector cannot contend with. That's my beginning.
Okay, that's a great beginning. I will note actually with your Philippines example that President SBY, who spoke this morning, his PhD is from the leading agricultural university in Indonesia. Huh? So a model to replicate. Just before I move on to Gita, just quickly, I mean, if you take the measures you just outlined, do you see a way to apply those to a sector dominated by small-scale producers, or what are the opportunities there that you think we should be pursuing collectively?
No, I think we need to go in and understand why. I mean, we went to see a lot of smallholders and said, look, we will help you manage your farms, right? Yeah. We will help the consolidation. We will manage it. And then some of them basically wanted to join us, as in the durian plantation, big durian plantations, but they could not detach themselves from the middlemen, the historical links. So this is something I think only the government can come in. Yeah. There probably needs to be a little bit of muscle to deal with this kind of problems. That's the reality. That's the ugly reality of it. But I don't think we should just say we have to live with this sub-economic plots forever. We need to deal with it because this is an urgent problem. And I think with focus and capabilities, we can.
Okay. No, great. Thank you. So Gita, take us into Indonesia. I mean, as you look at this problem, clearly a high priority for the new president. What do you see as the key challenges for Indonesia in cracking food security, and are there opportunities you're excited about?
Just to add on to what Nazir was alluding to, I think some of us, or some of you don't know that most of the farmers and fishermen and women, they're susceptible to predatory financing, which basically charges people at a rate of 3 to 10% per month. For the Americans, it's delusional. Yep. And for you to be able to pay 3 to 10% per month, you've got to go to the extent of being mortgaged. Your soul, your house, your motorcycle, your family, and all that. So that, I think, shackles the communities in many places, in not only Indonesia, but other developing parts of Southeast Asia. Number two, on the financing part, if you take a look at the money supply to GDP ratio of most places in Southeast Asia, inclusive of Indonesia, it runs at a rate of 45% of the GDP. So the money supply that's sitting in the country is only 45% of the GDP. Just to give you an illustration, most developed economies run at a money supply to GDP ratio of more than 200%. Even Malaysia is close to 200%. Singapore is well above 200%. So you have little money to work with to provide the necessary financing. That, I think, is structural. So the only way out is to bring in money from overseas. We call that foreign direct investment. Unless you want to quantitatively ease print money, like the way the Americans and Europeans have been doing for a long time, but we're not doing that in many places in Southeast Asia. So that's on the economic front. The second structural issue, I think, with respect to agriculture, which represents about 15% of the GDP in Indonesia, and that's characteristic of developing economies in Southeast Asia, 15% of the GDP, and it employs about 40 million farmers, which is a large part of the 280 million population of Indonesia. It is not blessed with the necessary educational attainment. As I've alluded to earlier this morning, 88% of the households in Indonesia are headed up by somebody without a tertiary education. Not to mention the electorate, 93% of the electorate in Indonesia does not have a university of education. So if you're expecting policies to remedy the pre-existing structural issues, you've got to be mindful of these statistics, right? Where the people in the households don't have the necessary advanced education, the people that are supposed to be making policies as to help remedy the pre-existing structural issue they don't have the kind of comprehension with respect to the dynamics of the problem and how to remedy them. And the third is really with respect to how the economic evolution has taken place in many democracies around the world. If you flip the narrative, right, China has been politically centralized, but paradoxically, economically decentralized. So this has helped, I think, communities in many parts of China to be much more robust. Whereas Indonesia is a democracy, politically it's decentralized, but economically a lot more centralized. If you're in some regency, municipality, province, or whatever, if you want to get financing, you want to get permits and all that, you have to go to the center, right? That, I think, has been a structural impediment for decentralization of economic activities, particularly as they relate to the coastal communities, particularly as they relate to the farmers. The last bit, I would just say that, this is a country that consumes about 3 kilograms of beef per capita per year, as compared to the Brazilians and the Germans who consume about 45 kilograms of beef. No wonder their steaks are much better than ours. And the productivity of rice in Sragen, which is probably the most fertile ground in Indonesia and Central Java, it's at about 5.5 to 7 tons per hectare, as compared to Thailand, which does about 14 to 15 tons per hectare, just in rice. So I'm in the camp that would like to advocate for a much more robust cross-fertilization of best practices within Southeast Asia. How do we do that? I think it kind of dovetails back to what I alluded to earlier this morning, in that there needs to be some degree of revision to that principle of subsidiarity within ASEAN. I think if there is a best practice somewhere in Southeast Asia, there is no reason for other countries not to be able to copycat or emulate such best practice, particularly in a sector like agriculture, which employs about 40 million farmers. And it is so politically sensitive, as Nazir aptly pointed out. And this is not just uniquely in Indonesia. This is characteristic in many other developing economies throughout the world. So I think if we take the right view on educational attainment within the households, within the electorate, take the right kind of view in terms of further decentralizing economic activities so that there's more robust economic activities, particularly as they relate to coastal communities, then a better education that we need to move up the value chain so that we can eat more beef, more protein, more whatever. I think there's hope. And last, the cross-fertilization of best practices. I think Malaysia does a really good job in, cultivating agriculture almost to the level the Thais do. But I think Indonesia could learn a lot from places like Malaysia and Thailand.
Yeah. Okay, I want to come back to the ASEAN for a broader discussion after we've heard from David. But first, one thing. You talked about two things that I think would be great to unpack a little, to hear you unpack. So one is the sort of tyranny of the middlemen, right? I mean, the fact that small producers are hostage to these local lenders, basically, right? But also the centralization of economic activity. So could you just talk a little bit about how those two realities fit together and how one breaks it, basically?
Well, typically, if you're an entrepreneur in the remote area of Indonesia, you would think twice about making a trip to Stuttgart or Shenzhen.
I see.
You would rope in somebody from Jakarta. Whereas if you're the mayor of Chongqing or Chengdu, you would rope in an entrepreneur from the respective zip codes, and you'd make a trip to Stuttgart and try to pitch the idea of putting and building a factory. That, I think, is a good practice that could be and should be emulated by many others around the world, including those in Indonesia. Now, with respect to the predatory financing, the only way to remedy that is to make sure that there's a lot more money supply in the system. And there is not enough money supply in the system. And this is manifested in the banking assets, which are at a ratio of only 45% of the GDP, the capital markets at a ratio of 45% of the GDP, that's largely, if not exclusively, driven by the fact that there's only money supply at 45% of the GDP. So you got to put more money on the table. And if you can do that, I think you can unshackle lots of the shackles that have been shackling, the little people and those at the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. So David, so I mentioned your background is very broad, but you've come into the region really with the focus on human rights and the rule of law and done amazing things there over the last 25 years. Can you just talk a little bit about how, starting from that lens, one ends up so active on issues like food?
Well, I'll actually begin with durian.
Okay. All good things begin with durian.
Although so much of my work has been in Indonesia, I have been engaged in Cambodia for the last 20 years. And I have to assure you that the Cambodians tell me that Cambodian durian is vastly better than Malaysian or Thai, and they don't even know that there's Indonesian durian. But that tells us something about ASEAN as well. So more pertinently, Jim, to your question. Having worked a lot on rule of law, justice sector reform, human rights, particularly in Indonesia and East Timor, Cambodia, elsewhere in the region, as the human rights sort of perspective became increasingly informed by thinking about sustainability. And for me, it certainly has, because I think if we're thinking about human rights as really focusing on the issues of social justice and well-being for people, what is more essential than food, right? It's the heart of human society. It's necessary for cognitive development, as we've heard. And food insecurity, and I'll just put on my historian hat for a moment, because you mentioned that twice. Food insecurity is a perennial source of political instability. Food insecurity, food crisis, famine, and so forth are historically associated with political instability everywhere. So, but at the same time, in thinking about sustainability, thinking about food, it's been our conviction, here in the work that we've done and so forth, is that the only solutions are going to be holistic solutions. And that the relationship between food security, between environment and environmental sustainability, the relation of all this to energy and so forth, is unavoidable if we want to have an impact. And we look at areas in Southeast Asia where environmental degradation is linked to food insecurity, to declining agricultural production, to the impact on fisheries and coral reefs and that communities depend upon and so forth. Those are drivers of migration. They create vulnerabilities that result in exploitation and human trafficking, in population movements that can have an enormous societal impact. So, but I think at the same time, what we see in Indonesia, I think, is a real opportunity to address some of these issues because of the national food program that has been announced by the Indonesian government, and especially the expanded one under the current administration, because it involves not only school meals, but preschool. And of course, preschool is essential for combating stunting. Stunting is really an issue that is most directly connected with the first 1,000 days of life. So if you're not addressing that in a preschool population, by the time that children get to school, of course, they also need nutrition for their development. But it needs to be, so food security needs to be thought of as one of the most pressing social problems, I think, which then inevitably makes it a political problem as well. And so I think, and going back to the issue of exploitation through brokers and supply chains, and in Cambodia, it's also 8 to 12% per month for small scale farmers. I think that's where, we're trying to look at opportunities to use the food program as a way of getting small scale producers, and especially we're looking at small scale fishers and aquaculture to market locally into the food program rather than into these extended supply chains that leave them with very little. Because not only of this issue of exploitation, but the lack of infrastructure. If you don't have cold chain, if you don't have the ability for small scale fishers, which is 90% of Indonesian fishing, to do more than sell their fish on the dock so it doesn't go bad, within a few hours, then they're inevitably going to be in the hands of these brokers. The same with Indonesia. Many people, I think, don't know, is the second largest producer of seaweed in the world, second only to China. Where does Indonesian seaweed go? It goes into an extended supply chain that winds up being processed in China, which means the producers are getting almost nothing for their product before it passes through 5 or 6 hands and winds up on a ship going to China. So those are the kinds of issues that I think we're all trying to address, and that's what brought me from human rights into food.
Well, then, I just to put an emphasis on that last point, one of the things that strikes you about the school meals program is there's at least the potential for win-win-win results, right? I mean, better nutrition for children, livelihoods for some of the poorest communities in the country, right? And actually an opportunity to elevate the role of women, which is often neglected in those sectors. So there's at least tantalizing potential there. Now, we are going to make time for questions, so please think of your question. I promise we will get to that in a few minutes. But each of you has actually quite a lot of experience in ASEAN and in regional cooperation. So I'd love to hear from you about what ASEAN could be doing here. I mean, Nazir, when we were talking before, you mentioned that ASEAN has 46 working groups on food, which is slightly
49.
49. No, anyway, so that's a little scary. But clearly, I mean, this is a region where cooperation has had lots of potential in various domains. What's promising here? And I'll start with you. What would you like to see ASEAN doing? How can ASEAN help countries meet these challenges?
I think I agree with Gita's saying just now about the importance of information sharing, cross-fertilization. And interestingly, there is an ASEAN food security information system, right? So actually, Gita is already there in the system. The problem is, I think, they collect the data, but nobody draws on the data. Yeah. And here it goes back to my point. That if you just have all these beautiful plans, we have 5-year plans on food, on agriculture and food security cooperation, etc. You have these beautiful plans, but nothing gets executed for 2 reasons. One, the bureaucracy in most countries, and 2 is the lack of any power at the ASEAN level. So I'm with Gita on this. We do need, as part of recalibration of ASEAN, to cede more power to the center so that things can get done. And then we go into the big conversation about non-tariff barriers and other things. But my message to the governments and every session I have with leaders on behalf of the private sector is this: that at this time, given what's happening globally, if ASEAN cannot turbocharge integration now, it never will. Right? This is the time ASEAN really needs to step up.
So does that mean putting ASEAN on a path to becoming something like the European Union?
No, we never want to be I think even Europe doesn't want to be like European Union. But we need to find the right balance between where we are today and a little bit more. Definitely not nowhere near European Union. But I think if you look at the agriculture sector, there's just so much more we can do. So we, for instance, the president of Philippines sent a delegation of Filipino agriculture companies to Malaysia. And there you had business meeting. And we had some great potential collaborations in agri-tech. Also, we've now committed to growing Musang King durian in Philippines and so on. So when businesses meet their good ideas, but when the crunch comes, there are still execution issues where I think the state needs to get involved.
So, Gita, have you seen examples where collaboration through ASEAN has led to change? I mean, to implementation action?
Yeah, I mean, he's right. I mean, Nazir is right. The structure is there, but it's not cultivated to the extent necessary. And this is where I think perhaps Indonesia could play a role a little bit more proactively. I mean, ASEAN, Indonesia makes up about 43% of Southeast Asia's population and GDP. And to the extent that the leadership in Indonesia proactively says the right set of things that would basically entail leadership, this is a well-needed commodity for Southeast Asia. And I do believe that the current leadership has the necessary internationalism for such purpose. He's only been in the office for a few months. I think time will tell as to whether or not that internationalism will translate into the kind of cultivation of the pre-existing structure that would translate into more cross-fertilization of best practices, not only as they apply to agriculture, but I think to other well-needed commodities. That's first. Second, it's mathematically impossible to unionize the way the Europeans have for Southeast Asia at the rate that you've got one country earning less than $2,000, another earning $91,000. So if you're trying to unionize on a monetary system, that's mathematically impossible, much less fiscal, which the European Union doesn't have. If you were to aspire to unionize for immigration purposes, we're already very much open-minded. We even allow the Americans to enter Southeast Asia very easily, right? So I think we're there, but I'm advocating for a bit of a revision to that principle of subsidiarity, because the charter of ASEAN actually allows for anything that would mean the betterment for the region as it deals with global challenges, right? And agriculture is structural. Food security, energy security are structural as the region needs to deal with, the challenges that are, I think, coming at a higher exponential evolutionary pace.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see anyone at the mics. Oh, okay, so let me ask David a quick question, and then I'll go to you at the mic. Okay. You've worked with ASEAN for a long time. I mean, one of the themes we've heard from Gita and Nazir is the lack of capacity to address these problems. I mean, do you see ASEAN playing a role in meeting that challenge, the capacity of governments in particular?
Well, I think that's very widely recognized in, the region, and I agree completely with what my colleagues have said. And I think certainly Indonesia, but also Malaysia, has an important role to play in exerting that kind of leadership. And I just want, since we're talking about food, just quickly refer to one area where that kind of better regional governance is needed, is what's happening in what's called the Lower Mekong subregion, where the massive number of dams, giant dams for hydropower that have been built on the Upper Mekong in China and on the Lower Mekong in Leape PDR, now in Cambodia also, is having a massive environmental impact on the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia, the Tonle Sap, which produces more fish than every lake and river in the United States combined, and provides 60% of the protein for the entire population of Cambodia. And that fishery is dying. And it's dying through a combination of the effect of the dams, of climate change and extreme weather, of other sources of environmental degradation, bad governance, and so forth. And that's only part of the Mekong region, on which 120 million people depend for protein, and the impact that it has in the Mekong Delta, reverse salinization, which is impacting rice production. The Mekong River Commission has been ineffective in dealing with this. That's where ASEAN leadership is needed. You have five Mekong countries involved, and you have no solution in sight. And if we don't get leadership at the regional level, it's just going to keep getting worse.
A perfect example. Okay, thank you. Yes, a quick question.
Yes, my name is Jack. I'm a business operator in Indonesia. We focus on building EV two-wheelers and battery swapping. So, Pak Gita, so you mentioned about the tight money supply in Indonesia. And I think I find it's very interesting because it relates to a lot of our customers not being able to afford buying motorcycles, or let alone transitioning to EV motorcycles. But also it's also sensitive to businesses like ours, where it is very difficult for us to find sustainable financing to expand our balance sheet. But this, to me, when you mentioned about the tightening of money supply, seems to be a policy choice. Not only the M2 to GDP is 40%, the national debt to GDP is also 40%. But I think on the bright side, you have a relatively stable exchange rate and also to a lesser extent stable inflation. But how do you see Indonesian government or central banks can change or its policy to actually start to improve the money supply in the economy while not causing too much negative effect? And I also like to address this question to Mr. Nazir, because
Okay,
working in the bank.
I've got to cut you off there. Is that okay? But he'll
Okay,
be
sure.
here afterwards.
Yeah,
Gita, do
sure.
you have a sort of 30-second answer to that?
30 seconds.
Yeah,
That's a
36
whole lecture,
seconds,
man.
or we can talk after.
Look, I think the way out is FDI, foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
We shouldn't print money. And Southeast Asia gets about $200 to $230 billion a year, of which Singapore gets 100 to 140 billion. Indonesia gets about 25 to 30 billion. Last year, it finally moved the needle up to 50 billion. But the rest, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam, each gets about 10 to 20 billion. And geopolitically speaking, it's a fantastic opportunity because there's likely to be much more reallocation of capital from this part of the world to other parts of the world. But the problem with Southeast Asia, generally speaking, not just with respect to Indonesia, we're not good in translating uncertainties into risk. There's a subtle difference between uncertainties and risks. To the extent that we can present ourselves as a set of quantifiable risks that can be measured and priced, that money will come. The money will come to any kind of risk as long as you can price it. So I think not just Indonesia, but I think the others will have to learn how to translate uncertainties into risks. And that, I think, is the way out, and I think it's opportune.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So then just quickly in wrapping this panel, first, I hope what you take from this is that food security is absolutely central to the sustainability and development challenges in this region for all the reasons this panel has outlined. We're going to crack that. It is partly about bringing in the level of foreign direct investment that is needed to rise to this challenge, and also about the role of government in making this a challenge that businesses can invest in solving. Lots to do, but thank you. Help join me in thanking this panel for taking us.